Have you ever been exactly where the Lord led you when all of a sudden things around you became tumultuous and panic set in? If so, stick around for today's message. In this passage, we'll hear about Jesus' disciples and their obedience, which placed them in the midst of a violent storm where they too experienced a moment of panic. If we're meeting for the first time, I'm Tabor, pastor of Divine Church located in Metro Atlanta, where we believe it's about His will, His way, His word. Let us now receive this short but motivating word. Matthew, the 14th chapter, verses 22 through 27. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." I want to speak to you the next few moments from this thought. Don't panic. Pivot. Just prior to our text, the disciples have witnessed Jesus feed 5,000 men. This is not even counting the women and children. And he did all of this with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. But not only that, there were 12 baskets of leftovers that the disciples had to collect. Won't he do it? Will he? Won't he? Here in today's text, the gathering is over, and Jesus has commanded his disciples to get into a boat and go ahead of him to the other side. I want to tell us that once we decide to follow Jesus, we must remember he'll sometimes provide specific instructions regarding what, when, where, and how it is that we are to accomplish our assignment. The instructions provided to the disciples was specific. Get into the boat, go ahead of me to the other side. Look at Jesus becoming an instant travel agent. He's booked their transportation, set their itinerary, and picked their destination. But I want to ask us a question. Could it be that sometimes we've ended up in the wrong place simply because we've chosen our own destination instead of going where God has led us? Here in verse 24, we learn the disciples have boarded the boat and launched out to sea. They're doing exactly what Jesus has commanded, and they're on their way to where he has told them to go, and they are met with trouble. No doubt, I believe that when they set sail, man, the skies were blue and the winds were favorable, and at first it was smooth sailing. Sometimes after nightfall, however, they sailed directly into a storm. It is now dark, and the boat is struck repeatedly and violently by the winds and waves, tossing them back and forth, leaving them totally helpless. I must admit, though, as I studied this text, an interesting question came to my mind. Why in the world would Jesus send his disciples out on the sea when he knew they would encounter a fierce storm? Could the answer be he needed to teach them the importance of trusting and obeying him even when he's not present? Perhaps he wanted them to learn that they'll encounter some storms in life that will require them to use their skills and experience, but even with that, it won't be enough to deliver them. Wow. They're out there. Look at them, operating in obedience, doing as the Lord has commanded them to do, and still they encounter a storm. I believe, to those of you who are watching, that the takeaway in this text is this. Even though we are obedient, it does not exempt us from experiencing life's storms. Can you see them? They're way out there, too far to turn back, and they seem to be weathering the storm until verse 26. This is when Jesus comes walking on the lake. Can you even imagine experiencing a fierce storm, wondering if you'll survive, and then having the additional concern of dealing with a ghost? For many of us watching, We would probably say TOO much. The disciples thinking Jesus is a ghost, they're fearful and they are in panic. But let's not judge them too quick now. I think we should admit that we've been in situations that have caused us to be fearful and to panic. But someone may be wondering, what actually is panic? Cambridge Dictionary defines it this way: a sudden strong feeling of fear that prevents reasonable thought and action. In other words, panic is to suddenly feel so worried or frightened that you can't even think or behave reasonably. Verse 26 states, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It is a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. Obviously, now being stricken by temporary panic, their behavior is reasonable. But look at what happens next. Immediately, Jesus identifies himself and in essence says to them, don't panic, pivot. You see, in verse 27, he says, take courage, which simply means to feel confident and hopeful because of something. Not only does he provide them with the much needed comfort, but he also tells them why they need to pivot. It is I, he says, followed by, don't be afraid. I know normally when we talk about the word pivot, it refers to a change or sudden change in direction, but you also need to remember it could be a change in focus. He wanted them to change their mindset from hopelessness to he's here. In closing, I wonder, how many times have Jesus showed up in the middle of our storms and we ourselves didn't even recognize him? We're too afraid, we're so scared, he had to identify himself to us and comfort us. Perhaps it was a foreclosure. You panicked. Job lost. I understand you panicked. Repossession. Maybe you are there panicked. Loss of a loved one. Naturally, you panic. Your spouse walk out on you? I could understand you panic. All of us experiencing global unrest, and we're panicking. A global pandemic, and we're panicking. My simple message to each of you watching today is this: when the storms of life continue to rage and you can't tell the night from day, take courage. Don't panic. Pivot.